Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
Favorite players?
Favorite players?
Favorite athletes?
I grew up in Baltimore, and you love the players that you grew up with. It's like your first kiss. It's like you love the music when you were a kid. Johnny Unitas, Brooks Robinson. And that can never change. And then after 50 years, it hasn't. Nothing can change those first moments. Sports is for kids, isn't it?
There's so much wrapped up.
And you're always writing about
and you're always a kid when you're a sports fan, no matter how old you are.
Welcome back to Baltimore and the CFL Live Halftime Report. The Argos in Baltimore are the showcase for the first half, but now at halftime, a very special evening here in Baltimore. This stadium has been home to some great athletes over the years, of course, for the old NFL Colts and the Baltimore Orioles. And throughout this season, Baltimore will honor players from both clubs. And right now, they're honoring three of them right now. Art Donovan a moment ago. Now Lenny Moore, the great running back for the Colts.
On behalf of my family, to keep the tradition alive, my wife, my brothers and sisters, my friends, and all of you, thank you so very much.
Lenny Moore, ladies and gentlemen. Our third inductee is simply the greatest quarterback of all time. In 17 seasons with the Colts, he established 22 team records and 8 NFL records. He was the first quarterback to throw for over 40,000 yards. He led the league in TD passes 4 straight years. His 47-game stretch with at least 1 touchdown pass will last forever. The records keep coming, huh? He was the NFL most valuable player 3 times, All-Pro 6 times, and he played in 10 Pro Bowls, and he quarterbacked the Colts to 3 World Championships, and on July 28, 1979, was inducted into the Hall of Fame. He is the Golden Arm John Unitas. John, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here. After a long absence, football is back in Baltimore. We thank Jim Spiros for that. And we also thank you fans. You're the one who receives the credit for supporting the team, and hopefully will be successful throughout the years. My congratulations to Jim and to all of you. Thanks for your support over the years. Appreciate it.
John, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the first honorees for Baltimore's new Ring of Honor. John Unitas,
There's
Lenny
still
Moore,
more to come on the CFL Live Halftime Report. We'll hear from Art Donovan and John Unitas. John and Leaf will have halftime highlights. It's all coming up from Baltimore. Welcome back to Baltimore, where a very special ceremony was held at halftime of this football game. And joining me now, I got to say, as a football fan, this is a big thrill. Johnny Unitas, who starred here for so many years. It's got to be great to see football fans back in this stadium.
Well, it's great. I love to see it for the city and for the people. They've been starving for football for the past 10 years. And Mr. Spiros was strong enough to bring a football team in, a Canadian football team in here. And they're doing well, I think, at the gates, and they're playing well on the field.
You threw for a lot of yards in the National Football League. You've had a chance to see the CFL now. How do you like the passing game here?
Well, it's a lot easier. So I think it's fine. The fields are wider. It's more conducive to that type of football.
Do you think as a quarterback it gives you more options than 4 down on the narrow field would?
Well, you have 3 downs here. Of course, you have to produce on the first 2 downs, but your passing game is a lot simpler because most of the time you're throwing against single coverages, and you have more field width of the field to be able to run a lot different type of patterns than you would be with our operation.
Johnny, thanks for talking to us. Welcome home.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You wonder what Johnny Unitas might have been throwing footballs in the Canadian Football League on a field this big. He said it would be a little easier.
Well, I think he's right. There's bigger lanes to throw in, obviously, but I think a man of Johnny Unitas' stature would have had success anywhere,
Absolutely.
any league, at any time.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here.
The winningest coach in National Football League history, Don Shula, died on Monday. Shula's storied career spanned over 3 decades as a head coach for both the Baltimore Colts and the Miami Dolphins. Shula guided the Dolphins to 2 Super Bowl victories, which included the only 17-0 perfect season ever recorded by a team in 1972. He was enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1997. Shula was such an enduring figure in professional football that one of his former players, fearsome defensive lineman Bubba Smith, once joked, quote, "If a nuclear bomb dropped, the only thing I'm certain would survive are AstroTurf and Don Shula." Don Shula was 90 years old.
Unitas throws, completing to Moore. He's at the 40, the 35. Moore goes for a touchdown.
In 1956, Johnny Unitas joined the Baltimore Colts and spent the next 17 years wowing fans.
Johnny, you let them go. He's got it!
He was the centerpiece of the 1958 Colts-Giants championship that became known as the greatest game ever played. It was the first nationally televised NFL game and the first title game to go to sudden death overtime.
Unitas takes. He gives to Amici and the ball game is over.
After leading Baltimore to their first title, Unitas became a household name and his legend only grew. As a Colt, he won 3 championships, Super Bowl V, and was a 3-time NFL MVP. Johnny U's remarkable record of 47 straight games with a passing touchdown stood for over 5 decades until Drew Brees set the new mark in 2012 with 54. Baltimore's Golden Arm held every major quarterback record when he retired. He was inducted into the 1979 class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
It is football Sunday morning here from the 55-yard line on what should have been the start of the CFL preseason for Scott and I. However, the pandemic, while taking away our 3-down game this past year, has allowed us to catch up on our reading and rediscover the joy of just sitting back and losing ourselves in some great football books. Among the greatest of football books is Jack Gilden's Collision of Wills, about the relationship of John Unitas and Don Shula and the times they lived in. Jack, welcome to our podcast. And while I know that neither Shula nor Unitas ever played in the CFL, their legacy was kind of ever present during the Stallions' brief time in Baltimore. which is a city with unbelievable rich football history. Thank you for coming on this morning and speaking with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
One thing, just to echo everything that Greg said, this is such a terrific book. And I think, a fan on the outside looking in, you think of Johnny Unitas and Don Shula, and there's a certain amount of hero worship. What possessed you to do something where you kind of pull back the curtain a bit and really show what kind of people they were, just as individuals and how they came to clash?
Well, I just thought that they were compelling people. And the thing that struck me that was so interesting about them is that you could look at either one of them individually and say he was probably the greatest at his job in the history of that league. Unitas in particular, I think, would be in that short list conversation of greatest quarterbacks. And because he came first, he's kind of the Babe Ruth figure of that world. And then Shula had a great winning percentage. He had the only undefeated season. He's got the most victories in the history of NFL coaching, and a super long career with only 2 teams. And I thought it's very compelling that these two men who were so great never won a championship together. It's always, we're always told that the formula is quarterback and coach, and we've seen it over and over again since Hallis and Luckman. And that seems to be what wins in that league over any other factor. And yet those two didn't win a single championship together in 7 seasons. And I thought, well, there's a story there.
And when it came to the story itself, Baltimore is such a huge part of this. I mean, as I read the book, Baltimore is the other character in this book, and the history that was going on at the time in Baltimore in the United States. To me, I thought that was such a great addition and really made your book more than just a football book. Can you tell me a little bit about the research process, just with talking about the history of the town and how much the city of Baltimore changed during that era between when they first started together and by the time, Shula left?
Well, there were several factors that went into the decision to make Baltimore such a big character in the book. So one of them was just like, I'm a big fan of Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and always London is so interestingly described in those books, and it's always such a part of the action that happens between the two main characters and the situations they're in. And so I wanted to kind of recreate Baltimore in a way, not to put myself in his company, but I thought that was a great literary device, and it puts the reader right in the action, I thought. And then secondarily, I kind of saw like if you think of the title Collision of Wills, I kind of saw the relationship between the two men, which behind the scenes was so ugly. And I kind of saw the relationship as a metaphor for the entire country at that time. And so Baltimore is a great little, like a miniature America. And it has all the same kinds of things going on here that go on in the country at large, and especially racially and social class and things like that. And I just thought, well, nobody really exists independent of their times. We're all part of our times. And more than that, no matter how insignificant we think we are, we're all part of creating the times. We create the times that we live in. It's up to each of us individually to make them what they are, good or bad. So what I wanted to kind of show was how these guys became so important by the end of the decade. They kind of came into the decade, and you could see how they were like America. But by the time the decade ended, you could see how America was striving to be like them, and that was very interesting to me. In the beginning of the decade, the fans came, wearing jackets and ties and fedoras to the stands. They were primarily white. They were primarily men. And by the end of the decade, it was very much an integrated crowd in the stands. The people were wearing the colors of the football team and football paraphernalia and things like that instead of suits and ties. And it was clear that the football players, and especially those two men, were setting the agenda for the country and for the culture as much as they were being influenced by it.
One thing that I really learned from your book is just, my knowledge of Unitas was sort of a guy who just clocked in, did his job, clocked out. And then reading your book, you find out, what a fragile ego he had. And that just what was your journey to learn so much about the character beyond what I guess sports fans knew about him?
Well, his daughter, who is his oldest child, was a good friend of mine for many years before I wrote the book. And the book couldn't have been written without her help. And so she was the one who really gave me a window into a side of him that I really don't think any of his biographers ever really properly explored or described, which was kind of his inner life a little bit, the life, kind of the secret life that we all have, or the private life that we all have. And so she was able to describe for me, much of his fragility that you're referring to, and also much of how he was in his private life, in his family matters and things like that. And he was a fragile ego. I mean, she would say, I would say, well, what's the problem? What was the problem between Johnny Unitas and Don Shula? And she'd say, he would say to her, what is he going to teach me about playing quarterback? He had a very good sense that he understood that position probably better than anybody else in the world. And he didn't think that anybody, could really teach him anything about it, least of all a guy who played defense and not very well.
And when it came to their relationship, they were teammates for a while. Was their relationship as teammates? I know they played on opposite sides of the ball, but did that strain start when they were players, or did that happen after he became coach, after Shula became coach?
I think it started as they were players, but a lot of the people that I interviewed disagreed with me about that, and most pointedly, Raymond Berry and Charlie Winter. And Charlie was, in his upper 80s when I met him, and he was the Colts defensive coordinator under both Eubank and Shula. And he was there the day Unitas walked through the door. He helped evaluate him. He helped teach him. And they both said no, that there would have been no hard feelings about the way things went down in practice. But Unitas and Berry were lighting up Shula every single day. Shula was an established player. Berry was like a 20th round draft pick or something like that. And Unitas had already been cut from a team, which in those days was a real, really a big insult. And yet in practice, they're starting to really lay it on him. And, as Berry said, Shula did not really have the speed to compete in the more modern NFL. So he'd had, high interception rates, or I shouldn't say high, but decent interception rates every year he was in the league as a cornerback, but he just did not have the speed to continue competing against guys like Berry and especially guys like Lenny Moore and people like that. So they're lighting him up in practice. And, Berry said, well, no, nobody would have held a grudge about something like that. But he also said that both Unitas and Shula were the two of the most competitive men he'd ever met in his life. He said, I was in the NFL as either a player or a coach for more than 50 years, and I never met one individual that was more competitive than either one of them. So, think about who some of the individuals he would have known as a coach at Dallas. He worked for Tom Landry. He coached. He probably coached Mike Ditka. He knew some pretty competitive men in his days, but he found that Unitas and Shula were the two most competitive men that he'd ever met. So in my opinion, I thought that there was definitely hard feelings. They went into a game at Washington after Shula was cut from the Colts, and it was a big humiliation to him to be cut. And then he the Redskins picked him up in 57, I think, and the Colts went down there and they played him near the end of the year, and they torched him for Berry had 250 yards receiving in that era, 250 yards receiving, lining up right across the ball from Shula. So I asked Shula about it when I interviewed him, and I said, well, what happened there? He said, well, when I came into that game, I knew how good they were. And he said, I vowed to myself they weren't gonna complete any long ones over my head. I said, oh, listen, what did happen? He said, well, they completed quite a few right in front of me, he said. So, you know, he was put out of the league. He was run out of town, and then he was run out of the whole league by those two. So I think there was, you know, that there was something to that.
What were you just saying kind of reminds me, your book is so well researched. I think there's like 30 or so different people that you talk to. Are there some things that you learned that you really wanted to get in the book that you couldn't? I mean, because there had to be so much information that you just simply couldn't get in.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you hear certain negative things about this or that person, and you may want to publish it, but it's not necessarily substantiated, you know, things like that. You know, so you don't really want to put that in your book if it's something that might hurt somebody's reputation, and you can't really substantiate, you know, what it is that you know. So in other words, if it's something bad enough, you'd want to hear it from 2 or 3 or 4 people, you know, because you'd want to be extra sure before you would print it. You know, there were 1 or 2 things like that.
And you said you sat down with Shula. How was he? I know when you sat down with him, obviously he was retired and towards the end of his life. But when you talked to him and his recollection, how was he? I mean, I get the feeling that in the interviews that I've seen other people have with Shula towards the end of his life, he had seemed content, happy, and kind of at peace with a lot of things in his career. Is that how you found him when you sat down with him and talked about and all those memories way back when?
Well, it was startling to see him because my view of him, of course, was shaped entirely as a coach. You know, when he was young and fit and you know, very vital. And then by the time that I met him, he was using a walker. I think he'd hurt his leg and he'd put on some weight because he wasn't probably getting much exercise, and his memory wasn't entirely sharp. It was, you know, it was good, and you know, you could talk to him about things from his Colts days, and he could speak about them. But then there were other points where you might ask him something and that you would think he would easily understand, you know, easily remember, and it was not easy for him to grasp it. You know, his son was briefly on the Baltimore Colts long after Shula left for Miami. His son was a receiver with the Colts, you know, in one of the last iterations of the team. And I don't think he made it into the regular season, but he was pretty good. He had great moves. He was kind of like a Raymond Berry type, and he had great moves, and he didn't have great speed, but he had good, you know, really good hands, and made this great play where he went diving, you know, high into the air to make this catch in the preseason. And I brought it up to Shula. I remembered watching it myself, and I brought it up to Shula, and he had a great memory of that, you know, but he didn't have a great memory of Bubba Smith, for instance, you know, like, and at the time that they had drafted him, and he was like, that didn't work out too well, did it? You know, something like that, you know. So he could be very lucid about certain things, you know, like when I brought up his son playing for the Colts, he mimicked the great catch that he had made, you know, and it was exactly like it. But then, you know, he couldn't remember if Bubba Smith had worked out or not.
You know, one thing, I'm a Jets fan, so obviously the the story of Super Bowl III was quite interesting to me. And I guess this is more of a compliment than a question, but just the way you framed that game around the way the country was at the time, I thought was so really well done. And obviously, when that game was played, I was just a kid, so I didn't think of the political implications of it. But you know, then you look back years later and see that you did have sort of the younger upstarts that represent more of the quote unquote long-haired type people in the country versus the really conservative Colts. And I just really loved how you frame that part of the book.
Well, I mean, I think I even took it further than that because, and you might not like this so much, but I was almost comparing them to the situation in Vietnam. You know, it was like the Colts were like the Americans. They were, you know, a crusher. They were all powerful, and they were going in. You know, it was almost like they were going into the jungle to fight these untrained guerrillas, and got their ass kicked. You know, so it was you know, I almost saw the two events as metaphors for each other in a weird kind of a way. You know, and especially that year was a turning point in that war. That 1968, I believe, was the year of the Tet Offensive, and we were really struggling with that engagement there, struggling to understand it, struggling to find victory, or if there even was a such thing as a victory in a war like that. And then the Colts kind of went into that same type of a situation where they were, big expected winners and super powerful, and then they seemed to be befuddled out there.
In that time, that time period, I mean, we can actually really kind of compare it to the last year. Such a time of change. There was so much that was happening. And it seemed to me it was, that that Super Bowl III loss seemed to be kind of the changing of the guard in a way for the times where, the old NFL, the Unitas-led NFL was kind of giving way to Joe Namath and kind of the birth of modern football, kind of as we know it today, where you've got a lot of media involvement. Everybody's hanging on every word. I mean, God forbid you misspeak in the media nowadays. To me, it just seemed, when I was reading it, and of course with the pandemic going on, I'm like, man, there's a lot of parallels here to the times that we live in now.
Oh, I think so too. And I thought so as I was writing the book. I finished the book before President Trump was elected, and or right around that same time. So he wasn't as a factor. But you could see that the country was headed into a lot of turmoil, and a lot of the same issues that had really animated the '60s were coming to play here in the 2000s. It was very, very similar in that respect. But Joe Namath, you brought his name up, and he was one of the people that I interviewed, and he was such a pivotal figure in not only in football but in American life, I think. I mean, a really fascinating guy, very likable. He was as good an athlete as ever came into that league. I mean, he was just as great athletically as Dan Marino ever was, or anybody else who ever played in that league. And, but he was kind of an anti-hero. Unitas was like a World War II kind of guy with a crew cut, and he represented work ethic, and, he was every American virtue wrapped up into one. And Namath was kind of, I interviewed Gabe Talese for the book, who was a great sports journalist at the New York Times in the 60s and became one of the most important authors in the country, later on. And he said, Joe was a guy who kind of represented all the wrong things. He screwed too much. He drank too much. He led that hedonistic lifestyle that everything he did seemed antithetical to success in athletics. Everything that we were taught was wrong, and yet there he was sitting on top at the end. And I think there was a lot to that. I mean, it kind of the whole country was kind of changing in that same exact way that Namath seemed to embody.
Yeah, I just remember I was 7 years old the season of Super Bowl III, and I kind of grew up, as far as my love for football. Obviously, I grew up in Alabama, so it's sort of a, college, college football is all you had then. But I love the AFL, and that, I actually like the AFL better than the NFL. So I kind of grew up, I guess, with a little bit different vantage point of it. But then, reading your book, you can see, how so different they were, and just the, how people's perception of the leagues were. I mean, it's, I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, as I said earlier, but it's really remarkable at the different ideas that not just both those teams, but both leagues sort of represented at the time.
Well, I think too, one of the things that I tried to show there, and especially in explaining how it was that the Colts lost, I think what I was trying to show there was how ludicrous the idea that they were an inferior league was. And it was just not true. I mean, maybe in like the first few years, but I don't even know if it was true then. I mean, you think about the Chargers winning the AFL championship, and I think it was 63 and or 62 or 63, very early on, and that was as good a team as ever played football, with as great a coach as ever coached. I mean, I think that it was somewhat ludicrous that the one league was so far superior to the other. I think that Lombardi winning the first two games kind of created that aura, but he was really hard to unseat in the NFL, and he was almost a red herring. And it wasn't only because he was better, but he seemed to get all the breaks, and everything went his way somehow, and he was a hard guy to beat. So when you took him out of the picture and it became other teams facing each other, I think it was a very level playing field. And in fact, the Jets coach, Weeb Ewbank, you could make a very good case that he was the greatest coach in history. And Lombardi himself had a very hard time beating Ewbank. When he was the offensive coordinator of the Giants, he lost to him in the 58 championship game. When he lost to him, I think the first 4 times he played him as Packers coach, I think, or the first 3 times, something like that. You'll have to check it. But, he had a hard time with Ewbank. When he finally beat Eubank's team, he said that it was his biggest day in football was when the Packers beat the Colts for the first time. So, there was nothing inferior about the Jets to anybody. Ewbank had methodically built them, and they were an extraordinarily balanced team. They were a very, very good team.
And talking about the Jets and the Colts, there's another person that's really kind of factors into this whole story between the two, and that's Carroll Rosenbloom. What was that relationship? How did Rosenbloom affect that? How did Rosenbloom affect that relationship, do you think, between Shula and Unitas?
Well, I think that Rosenbloom made a key mistake in that whole thing, which was, for whatever reason, Gino Marchetti was the real leader of the Colts, not Unitas. And he had the most sway with the owner, and he was also had a lot of if you would see him talk, he didn't seem very charismatic, but he had a lot of charisma as a leader with the players. And he was kind of the one that put the kibosh on Ewbank and had encouraged Rosenbloom to hire Shula. And all this in secret meetings that, obviously Ewbank didn't know anything about. So when, Rosenbloom took his advice, they never really considered was the dynamics between the quarterback and the coach. I mean, to Unitas, Weeb Ewbank was his father figure. He'd lost his own father when he was like 5 years old. Most coaches had rejected him, and Ewbank was like family to him. He not only accepted him, he tutored him, and he believed in him, and he was a very avuncular sort of man. And obviously Shula and Unitas had the bad history, and they were almost identical in age. They were both, from the Rust Belt of America. They were both like first generation Americans or second generation Americans, something like that. Their families were from Eastern Europe. I mean, they were tough, hard ass kind of guys. And, nobody really stopped to think, well, what would the chemistry between those two be like? So I think that was a big mistake there. But I just want to say you're really correct in putting the finger on Carroll Rosenbloom as an important figure, not only in all of this, but in just the development of that whole league. His story is really buried because of the negative qualities associated with him, particularly gambling. So the league doesn't really like to talk about him, but he was so important in making the league what it was.
This is a bit off topic, but I am curious as far as your journey as a fan. If you look at the city of Baltimore and then the trauma of losing the Colts, and then you have the CFL team come in for a couple of years, and then ultimately you have the Ravens. Just from a fan standpoint, what emotions do you go through trying to accept a new team that comes along, which is supplanting a team with so much history?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Ask the question again.
No, I'm sorry. I was just, the Colts leave, and then before the Ravens came along, you had a CFL team come to town. So I was just kind of trying to figure out what the emotions of, you as a fan, of course, but like the people around you, the people in the city of Baltimore, how they tried to accept another team coming in and replacing a team that was so beloved and that was taken away in such ridiculous fashion.
Well, some of the fans embraced it, and the media talked about it because it was all that we had. But I don't think it ever really caught on that much. I had to happen to be standing next to the mayor when they were discussing bringing the CFL in, and I went into just like I was in my 20s or whatever. I went in to get like a cereal for breakfast that morning. The grocery store was right next to my row house, and the mayor happened to be in there. It was like the grand opening, and I said to him, I grabbed him. I said, "Don't let the CFL come here." He said, "Why? Why?" I said, "Because if you do, we're never going to get an NFL team again." I said, "You're going to tie up our only stadium with the CFL team," And to me, it was, and I think to a lot of Baltimoreans, it was somewhat insulting. I mean, we were the kings of the NFL for so many years, and then to be a CFL city did not sit right with a lot of older football fans, and so. They did have, a following here, but they weren't packing that stadium, on a regular basis. And I think that Baltimore always saw itself as a big league city and that belonged in the NFL.
And when the Ravens came back then, what was that feeling? I know I've read everything, books about, there was a feeling of like, we're stealing a team from another city. Baltimore, they were obviously happy, but what were the general, even for you, what were the feelings of the Browns coming then to replace
I think you nailed it. You got it exactly right. I think there was that feeling because I didn't think that, nobody really wanted to cuckold another mid-range city to get a team. We knew how bad it felt. And, but I guess the way I looked at it in the end was it was almost like a cosmic justice because we had lost one of the greatest, one of the most storied, one of the most, glorious franchises in the history of any sport. And in the end, that's exactly what we got back. The Browns, if there's any team that was, that equaled Baltimore's legacy in the league, it was the Browns, maybe one or two other franchises could compare, but not too many. And the Browns certainly were almost identical to the Colts in so many ways, and the two cities were so identical, so it almost had a feeling like we got back exactly what we had lost. And then it was hard to feel too bad for Cleveland because they immediately got a new stadium. They immediately got a new team. We were out in the wilderness for 13 years, and we were, in Baltimore, we were lied to. And, they really, really treated us in an insulting fashion. But Cleveland was not treated that way. They were immediately, made whole, and including they got to keep their whole, their franchise records and their franchise name and things like that. I think we all would have liked to have been the Colts again at that time. I don't think the city, the Ravens have already been here 25 years or so I don't think that the city feels that way anymore. But when they first got here, I think everybody would have loved it to have been the Colts.
Yeah, and as time has moved on, obviously, more and more people, we're part of the, all of us are part of that older generation who remember the Baltimore Colts. So do the Baltimore Colts come up a lot, say in the local media there, the history and everything that, for example, here in Chicago, the 85 Bears are constantly mentioned, always. But it's ancient history. So are the Colts way back when? Are they talked about as much now as say they were right after they left, or back in the 80s?
Well, yeah, I think so. They're talked about quite a bit, and there's still a lot of people here who remember them and were alive then. But people, let's say from, Unitas' heyday from the late 50s on up until like around 1970, there are less of those. But, they still talk about it. I don't think, the Ravens tried hard right from the very beginning to kind of honor them and bring them into the fold. But, like they have a ring of honor there, and all the Ravens are mentioned individually, and they have like one little placard for all of the Colts in the Hall of Fame. And, they don't have like say the Raymond Berry's name isn't up there, or Gino Marchetti's name isn't up there. It's just Johnny Unitas and the Colts. And then it has the numbers of the Colts who are in the Hall of Fame under it. So, they could have done a lot more, I think, to kind of, if between the two franchises, you really have a very, a top shelf football history, that would really match or exceed anyone's, Pittsburgh or Green Bay or anybody. But they don't, but for whatever reason, the Ravens don't really embrace that connection like they probably could and should. I think it would be to their benefit.
Yeah, and that surprises me. Obviously, I've never been to the stadium there at Baltimore, but I would have thought that with all that rich history there, that the Colts. I always got the impression, because there's a statue of Johnny Unitas outside the stadium, that the entire Colts legacy was honored by the Ravens. So it's not. It's just Johnny Unitas and the rest of the team. And then
yes, well, not only that, but for years they don't do it anymore for whatever reason. But the Ravens marching band had the American flag, the Maryland flag, the Baltimore flag, and a blue and white number 19 flag as they marched onto the field. So Unitas came to embody the entire era of the Colts. But it just, there were so many waves of great players that came through the Colts, much more so than the Hall of Famers. You think about great players like Jimmy Orr, Mike Curtis, Bubba Smith,
Burt
Tim
Jones.
Mutchler, Burt Jones. Right, Burt Jones was an awesome player. He really was. And you think about, how about Earl Morrall for that matter?
Oh, yeah.
So many great players that had played for the Colts that are not Hall of Famers. They should really honor the entire football tradition of Baltimore down there because it's just unparalleled.
Yeah. And, he's talking about Earl Morrall. I use Earl Morrall almost as, I don't know how to know the word, but I always use the term Earl Morrall to describe, hey, I need an Earl Morrall. And it's funny now at my age, I get the looks like, what are you talking about? I go, I need a reliable guy, older guy, backup that I can just say, and this happened a lot in the Navy. I go, I need that guy. I need that guy on my team. And they're like, what are you talking about? I need a guy that can come off the bench and literally take over from the get-go. And so they got me thinking, it's, the other part of this story, and again, it's been about a year since I've read the book, but Earl Morrall, how did he factor into this relationship too? Because him coming in like he did, and I know, and from what I understand, Johnny Unitas had no problems with Earl Morrall coming in. They were good friends. But how did him being part of that dynamic kind of affect everything with him and Shula? What was their relationship like, if you can tell us?
Well, I think at the beginning of the interview, you talked a little bit about Unitas being more fragile psychologically than what people would ever guess, and I think that Earl Morrall's presence had a lot to do with that. Earl Morrall was a damn good player, and I think Johnny Unitas knew it. Now Unitas was obviously a very, very secure in the sense that he had supreme belief in his own abilities, but he knew talent when he saw it. He knew Earl Morrall had a big booming arm, and he was a big strapping guy, and he was a veteran. I don't think that he necessarily brought the things to the table, the intangibles that Unitas did in terms of the knowledge of the playbook and the knowledge of the defenses and things like that. And also Unitas seemed to just have a really cuckoo desire to win and could really pull it out at the last second. But Morrall was a really good player, really good. And I think that his presence, I think that it was a little unnerving to Johnny U, because Morrall came just as Unitas got a terrible arm injury that might have ended his career. Morrall came there as Unitas was aging and, probably declining anyway, even if he didn't have the arm injury. And, so it kept him on edge in those last years of his career. He certainly wasn't the unquestioned starter. When he came back in '69, he was never really the unquestioned starter again while Morrall was there.
Yeah, Earl Morrall has always been just such an interesting character to me for the reasons you talked about, because this guy was a quality NFL quarterback. He wasn't just a quality backup quarterback who was thrown into service. This guy, you put him out there and he got the job done.
Well, he had a lot of bad luck in his career. So, for instance, he was elected MVP of every single team that he ever played on, in at least one season while I was there. And but he always seemed to be in the same place as a Hall of Famer or following in the footsteps of a Hall of Famer. He was in San Francisco with Kittle. He was in Detroit. I think he replaced Bobby Lane in Detroit. was replaced by Fran Tarkenton in New York, and he didn't get along that great with a lot of his coaches, which was surprising because he was such a, he seemed to be such a non-controversial guy who cleaved well to authority. And you could see, I mean, Shula was very fiery, very hard to get along with, but he and Shula were like best friends. I mean, for the rest of their lives, they really got along great, so he was a little bit of a tough nut to understand exactly, but I mean, to me, if Morrall had won Super Bowl III, but instead he laid an egg in Super Bowl III, that's unquestionably true. But if he had won it, he would be in the Hall of Fame today, I think. I mean, the last half of his career was unbelievably good.
And in terms of just the quarterbacks of that era, talking about Morrall, and you mentioned Joe Namath earlier. When you talked to Joe Namath, and this is the one question I've always had in watching old NFL films clips when Namath talks about Unitas and that. What did Unitas and Namath have a relationship, a mentor? I mean, what was their relationship
not
like?
At all. I mean, I think that Joe hero worshipped Unitas, and they were both from Western Pennsylvania, and Joe, growing up, I'm sure you've seen the NFL films and things like that. He wanted to be Unitas. He wore his number in high school, but Unitas didn't feel any affinity for Namath at all. I mean, he was just another guy. I think in some senses he didn't like him because he got paid a lot more than Unitas did, and right off the bat, he came into professional football with a huge contract. And I think that Unitas felt that he was more, hyped up more than great. But everybody respected Joe Namath. He had a great arm, and he was a great passer. He was a really good play caller. They were both tutored by Weeview Bank and taught the game by Weeview Bank. So I don't mean to suggest in any way that Unitas didn't respect him. I think Unitas respected everybody who could make it in pro football. But I don't think that he had any special connection to Joe Namath in any way whatsoever, but I think that Joe felt one for him.
And in talking with, not only Joe, but other people, I mean, was Unitas in my readings, not only of your book, but other books, it seemed to me he was kind of very distant at times. I know even with his children too, he was very distant at times. Is that what you came walking away with?
Totally accurate. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the way his teammates felt about him. That's the way his family members felt about him. He was, seemed to have an interior life, that nobody really felt like they knew him that well. The one exception to that rule, I think, was his daughter, Jan, who I think she felt like she did know him pretty well. And, and I think she was a lot like him in personality, in the sense that she saw things, she tended to see things in an unvarnished way. She didn't sugarcoat it because it was her father. She didn't sugarcoat it because he was a great man. She tended to see things in the way that she found them, and she's not shy about saying it. So outside of her, and I'm sure she would say her mother, I don't know that I met anybody that really felt like they knew him exceptionally well.
Segueing into, I think we talked earlier, you mentioned that you had just completed another book or were working on another book. I was wondering if you could talk about that for a couple of minutes.
Sure. I just wrote a book about the great racehorse, Spectacular Bid. And I don't know if you guys remember him or not, but he ran for the Triple Crown in 1979, and he won the Kentucky Derby, he won the Preakness. And then in a gigantic upset, he lost at the Belmont Stakes. It turned out like a day or two later, the trainer disclosed that he had stepped on a pin, the morning of the race, or in the late hours of the night before the race. And then about a week after that, the jockey, who was a great story in his own right, a teenager from Baltimore, from a very blue-collar neighborhood of Baltimore called Dundalk, that he got caught with cocaine in the parking lot of Disney in Los Angeles, and then he kind of fell out of the public eye. He was a cocaine addict for 40 years, and then died while he was still in his 50s. So it's a very interesting story that had never ever been reported properly, with a lot of twists and turns under the surface to kind of show the forces in racing and how it was able to bring down somebody with a lot of talent.
And kind of coupling on that, and in writing, what do you find? I mean, part of the fun part about writing is the research. And I know Scott and I have had this conversation. What is kind of your process when you start a project like that? Where is kind of your starting point in terms of, like, I know with football, it's easy to go back to the NFL films and the documentaries, but for you personally as a writer, when you say, hey, I'm going to write this book, where do you start at? And I've always been curious with authors, kind of their starting point and their methodology going forward.
Well, I'm probably less organized than most, and my method is probably more haphazard. But I just start off by talking to one or two people whoever they are that I can get a hold of. I start going through newspaper archives, and one of the benefits of writing about sports is that so much is documented in the daily newspapers, and so I start going through those things, or any magazines, or anything else that I can find that's written down. And then as I talk to my first people, I start asking them for more names. I try to publicize myself as I go, and then that way other people reach out to me. I mean, the thing in writing nonfiction like this is I think it's very important to have two kinds of sources, primary sources. One are these stars. It's like, it's great to talk to Don Shula, and it's great to talk to, Raymond Berry, but they're not necessarily going to tell you, the deepest, darkest secrets. Right. But when you start to find, like, hey, I was an equipment guy there for 20 years, and I saw those guys screaming at each other, and, you talk to family members, you talk to little known players, whatever. I mean, they are not only just as important, but they're more important. I think the public likes to see that you talk to the big names, but in reality, the book emerges from unknown names, from people that nobody's ever heard of, but were there, saw everything, knew everything. They could have grudges, they could have reasons to want to talk that more established people don't.
And I know, as time has moved on, when you did this book, I mean, a lot of people, affiliated with the Colts had passed on. And getting those interviews, how hard was it to get the Don Shula interviews, the Joe Namath? How many did you have to go through people on those, or could you just, we reached out to you on Twitter and saying, hey, we'd like to talk to you? Is it kind of a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both, but it was usually easy, but not always. So the first important interview I had for the Colts book was Raymond Berry, and that came because Jan Unitas helped me, and she got in touch with him. She recommended me to him, and she made it possible. And so I was able to speak to him. When I got to Shula, I did that by puttering around and finding kind of a back door to Earl Morrall, and then knew that Morrall was close to Shula because he played for him in both places and had a lot of success for him in both places. And so I called Morrall, and his wife was immediately very nice to me, and she got in touch with the Shulas because they were still very close friends that got together regularly and talked on the phone all the time to boot. She called Shula's wife for me immediately, and then when I got in touch with Shula, I think I went from my first contact on the phone with him to sitting in his living room in about 1 week. So, that's, you've got to find them and you've got to reach out to them, and your credibility is very key, things like that.
As far as that book, from cradle to grave, from when you first got the idea to when you finished, about how long did it take for you to get it written?
Like maybe 40 years. I think I initially had the idea when I was 15 years old. And then I finished it when I was in my, I guess I was like probably close to 50 years old. So, however many years that is, I obviously wasn't too adept at math, but somewhere in there, 35, 45 years, I don't know, whatever it was.
Yeah. So this was a little more than just writing 1,000 words a day.
Well, yeah, I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing as I began. I'd never written a book before. I was an everyday writer since I was a teenager. I mean, I would wake up every single day and write. I did it, I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I was one of the editors of my college newspaper. I worked in marketing and advertising for many years as a writer. And I, parallel to that, I had a kind of a freelance journalism career and wrote videos and things like that, sports videos, TV commercials, all kinds of things. But I had never written a book before. And so when it took me a lot longer to do it than it should have, just because I was teaching myself how to do it as I went. I think it's a lot more complex than what people understand. It's like you go on Amazon and people will kick you in your teeth and tell you how horrible you are and things like that, but they don't have any idea how hard the work is, how intricate it is, how complex it is, and how low paying it all is. They might have a little mercy on your soul if they understood.
Yeah, it's, just talking about that, Scott and I had this conversation just about, the financial aspect of writing books. It is truly a labor of love. And I've got friends of mine on the military side that have written some great books, and they're like, this is definitely a labor of love. And I know, like, your book it's a labor of love, but the one thing I like about your book is it brings kind of the romance, for lack of a better term, of that era back. There's just something about those Baltimore. I tell people in my football collection, I have a lot of books. Of those books, I want to say the vast majority are about the Baltimore Colts, whether it be about Unitas, whether it be about that era. What is it about the Baltimore Colts that, to this day, for a lot of us, when we hear that march, when we hear the marching band, the Colts march, and when we see those old clips, what is it about Baltimore specifically that brings back that nostalgia?
Well, I think a big part of it is the authenticity of that era. So, you could say that football today is almost like a shadow of football of that era. It resembles it, but it's not exactly the same game. And I think in that era, people look at it, and even the uniforms they wore were made of real fibers. The grass was real. It was all very authentic. And what I wanted to do was kind of recreate that authenticity and kind of show what made that game so great, but also kind of explain where it went and why we lost it that way. And, part of it is it's, there are levels in which it's a reprehensible game. I mean, those guys were bashing their brains out there, and in horrible equipment to boot. I don't even know if the equipment really makes any difference at all or not, but it was the authentic game was great because it was dangerous, but it was also awful because it was dangerous in much the same way, like say boxing is. It reveals, so many virtues about a person, about someone who really can overcome and deal with the adversity and deal with the danger and the fear, that comes along with playing that game. And, but at the same time, when you really think about it, rich guys get very, very rich, owning that sport, and the laborers, they lose their brains. I mean, it's a very compelling sport, but you have to come to grips with that aspect of it.
Yeah. And so when talking about just the physical toll the game takes on people, with Shula, obviously old age. I mean, he played the old. He was he played back in those days. And Earl Morrall. I mean, I know Earl Morrall died. I think he died of dementia. Am I correct?
Well, I don't know if he died quote unquote of dementia, but he had terrible dementia at the time he died. But I don't know what killed him, but yeah, I mean, he was declining physically, dramatically. When I saw him, he was using a walker, and he had some memory, but he was almost childlike, in his behavior. And he would, if I would ask him a question, he would point to his head and say, my recall buttons don't work too well. He would say that over and over. And so his wife assisted him in that interview. And, and so many of those players of that, that I spoke to or of that era were, all suffering through dementia issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, and just talking about that era too, Memorial Stadium. Tell me about Memorial Stadium. I mean, Scott and I mean, that's another character in every Colts book I read about that is always talked about. But what was Memorial Stadium like in terms of just the atmosphere, and kind of compare it to today? I mean, I have sat both in modern day Soldier Field and Wrigley Field in the same year, and there's such a difference in the feel of the modern versus the old ballparks. What was Memorial Stadium like on game day?
Well, Memorial Stadium was, interestingly, it was two things. It was an old stadium from the day it was built, and it was never really an old stadium. It wasn't even there that long, but it had the feel of a very old stadium because it was kind of dumpy, and it was kind of it was always looked upon, even in the 60s, as a third-class facility, and and things like that. But it was fun, and going back to the idea of authentic, I mean, the tickets were low cost, even by the standards of the era, so it was like a plebeian theater. I mean, it was great fun for the working classes, and and they loved it. That stadium was packed. It was sold out every single game for the entire decade of the 60s, which probably doesn't seem like a big deal now in this era of personal seat licenses and things like that. But it was unusual back then. And, they were always sold out. It was always, a crazy, environment in there. I think I have one story in the book where the Colts beat the Packers at Memorial Stadium, and Lombardi is furious at the end of the game, but he was less furious at losing than he was about a fan who came from the stands onto the field, walked right up to Lombardi and tapped him on the shoulder mid-game, and the guy was, skunky drunk, had said to him, asked him to please sit down and tell his assistant coaches to sit down because he and his buddies couldn't see the game from their seats. So he was just beside himself talking to the press after the game about how horrible they are in Baltimore. He hated it, that they were drunks, and that the police not only didn't do anything about it, but they seemed to encourage it. I think I read it. I don't know if you guys ever read Alex Karras's book, but I think he described being chased around the bench by a drunken Colts fan with a knife in his hand. He was circling him around the bench, running after him, things like that. That's kind of like what Memorial Stadium was like.
Yeah, and if my memory serves me correct too, didn't Mike Curtis deck somebody that ran out in the field?
Yeah. Mike Curtis decked somebody. I think he called him, he described him as a hubcap popper.
Yeah,
I think it was a hubcap popper. That was his career. Like he worked at General Motors or something.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, about the modern game, the game we have nowadays. You don't even see when somebody runs out in the field, they don't show them out in the field. But back in those days, I remember watching when somebody ran on the field, you saw the guy running out in the field, and the game is just the game has changed so much. Now, again, all of us, we're in the same age group, so we grew up in a different era. And just looking at the game now compared to then, do you think, well, it's hard to compare eras just to begin with, but as we've moved on, do you see the game having the same romance as it did back then? I honestly don't, but I try to. There are other leagues such as the CFL that to me are very old school, where you've got guys at work who play and then also work in the off season. Same way with all the other minor leagues. And I know back in Baltimore, back during the day, Johnny Unitas had a real job in the off season. So what, just kind of in terms of just kind of looking forward with the NFL, do you see the romance of that ever coming back?
No, I don't. I mean, I just think it's going through a life cycle, and I think that for me personally, and I've been watching football for a very long time, I think that that the heyday really was the 60s. It was invented by Unitas and Barry and Eubank in the 58 championship game. And then I think it hit its apex in the 65 game when the Colts played Green Bay in that special playoff game when they were tied at the end of the season. And it was just, that's what created modern football. It was from 58 to 65. And then, after that, it became a game that was more, it became oriented around different things than it was was before that. It became very, money oriented, as you're alluding to. I don't think there was that same hunger. I mean, what I found in that previous game, A, the danger was a big part of it, and B, the hunger of these guys. I mean, almost everybody I talked to came from these coal towns, steel mill towns. I mean, their fathers were the toughest men they knew. They equally loved and feared their fathers. They were determined never to go into their father's work. They didn't want to go down into a coal mine all day. They didn't want to be near a blast furnace. They were terrified of their father's lives. This is almost every single guy that I talked to, and their motivation came from wanting to have a different life. They weren't necessarily intellectually gifted people, and I'm not implying by any means that they were dumb. But if they weren't playing football, and in some cases, many of them would have been, laborers and people like that, and they didn't, and this gave them a way of making a salary that was far beyond what they could have earned, without it. But they were good guys. They went to college. They weren't by any means dumb people. I'm not at all implying that, and I'm not implying that about laborers in general. But what they could have done with their careers, it would have been nothing compared to what the opportunities that football offered them, and that's what made the level of competition so flaming hot. And today, I don't, in many cases, I don't know that the people are coming from the same poverty, and I don't know that, once they sign that first contract, I think a lot of them won't have too many worries for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think, especially maybe a younger fan now, they don't really realize that the NFL was not necessarily a big money league until relatively recent history. The WFL to a degree helped increase salaries, and I think the USFL really started the change where NFL players were making a lot more money. But yeah, in the era that you wrote about, I mean, certainly these guys did make more money than working in a factory, but a lot of them weren't necessarily getting rich.
No, but they weren't getting poor either. I think it's also a little overstated. I mean, like, I live about 10 minutes from Weeb Eubank's old house here in Baltimore, and he didn't live in a McMansion like Ray Lewis did. But he lived in a house that was like that you would expect like a bank president or a CEO or a surgeon would live in. He had a very nice lifestyle. And I think that many of the players, in that era, you think about people aspired to live in the suburbs and drive a nice car and things like that. I mean, they made a very nice living. They just weren't super rich people like they are today, but they made a very comfortable living out of football.
In terms of the money and playing football, Carroll Rosenblum obviously took care of his players. I mean, that was the one thing that in all my readings and even in reading your book, Carroll Rosenblum, he helped people out. I mean, he got people started in business, and even with Unitas, I mean, I don't recall, did Rosenblum help Unitas out much in terms of after his career, getting him started? I mean, I know they had an agreement for him to work for the team, but after Irsay bought the team, that agreement was off.
Well, he reneged on that agreement. And then it doesn't seem like Rosenblum helped Johnny U very much after football was over, but during his career, Unitas had a lot of businesses that he might have played a role in helping him start. I'd be surprised if he didn't, but I don't really have any specific knowledge of what he did to help him. But he had a bunch of businesses while he was still mid-career, restaurants and bowling alleys and all kinds of things. Later on, he got involved in electronics. But those businesses generally didn't end well for him, and he lost a lot of his money through all of those businesses. And he generally had partners that took advantage of him in a lot of them. But Rosenblum, he was very helpful to them. I mean, Marchetti and Amici became millionaires, because Rosenblum had the idea that they start a fast food restaurant, modeled on McDonald's. But the difference being that they used their names as the bait, because they were big celebrities. He understood the power of their celebrity at a time when very few other people did. And they started a fast food restaurant called Gino's, and they sold it for millions of dollars when, about 20 years later.
Yeah. And yeah, I know the one memory I have, I didn't watch Johnny Unitas play because I was too young, but the first memory I have of Unitas, just talking about after his career, was in the sometime forgettable movie Gus, when he played opposite Bob Crane as the color commentator for California Adams games. So it was, and actually now I watch that movie every now and then because it's got that old school NFL feel, NFL film style, which I love.
Yeah, I mean he later would trade on a celebrity to pull himself out of his financial troubles, and I think that by the time that he died, he was doing okay, and it was good that he had that celebrity, but he was robbed of a lot. His health was ruined by the game. His arm was useless to him, his right arm. All the years after football, it deteriorated, and then also, the Colts leaving was a terrible crime, committed against the players that had built that brand. And, they really built football altogether, and they certainly built the Colts. And when the Colts left, that really took a financial toll on the big stars like Johnny Unitas.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he was the face of the franchise. I mean,
right. And think about it, and that franchise was tarnished when they left, so he was the face of something in the end that, a lot of unpleasant memories were attached to it as well.
Yeah. And I know a few weeks ago, I just wrapped up reading his son's book about his dad. And that was very insightful in terms of just like you talking about the business dealings. And at least, with that book, it told me kind of the rest of the story, towards the end of his life and everything, that it seemed to me he kind of had come to peace with everything, even with the Colts leaving. It seemed like at the end of his life, I mean, unfortunately he died way too soon, but at the end, he didn't seem bitter at the end. That was from what I gathered.
Well, that is a son writing it, so I mean, I haven't read it, but he's not going to necessarily take the same point of view as a dispassionate third party.
Right.
But, so he may choose to see his father that way. And I really, didn't know his father. I wasn't familiar with him or what his points of view were at the end. I'd seen him around town a few times, and he was an extremely nice man. He was very genial, and he understood how much he meant to other people, but as far as like letting go of the bitterness of things, I mean, that wasn't, what I had heard or what I saw. I mean, one of the guys was like, talking about him not peeing on Shula to put out a fire, things like that. That was like just a couple of years before he died.
Yeah. Well, there's some grudges you never let go
with the Colts. No, and he never, believe me, he never reconciled with the Colts, and he never would. I mean, the Irsay family really did him wrong in the contracts, and then they humiliated him and, pushed him out the door, and then they took the whole franchise away. And he loved Baltimore. I mean, he was just as passionate about the city as any person born here. I mean, in fact, his daughter told me that, he never, ever wanted to leave Baltimore, and he never did. I mean, he never moved to like a more glamorous location. He lived here his whole life.
Yeah, there were a few weirder things than seeing Johnny Unitas wear a San Diego Chargers uniform.
What was one interesting thing about that? You talk about something that you left out of the book and that you were sorry you did. There was one newspaper piece I found where he was still an active player for the Chargers, and someone asked him about what was going on with the Colts at that time, and he referred to them as us or we. He was like, well, it's we have O'Brien playing wide receiver, and he's really a kicker. So what can you expect? So he was still saw himself as a Colt even when he was a Charger.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jack, we are going to wrap it up here. I know it is Sunday morning, and we are at that mark here. And in terms of just, I know Scott has moving to do, and I've got a honey-do list that is waiting for me here, and I know you've got places to be. Can you let everybody know where to find you on social media, and also where to buy your book at? Buy all your books.
Well, he could look me up on either Twitter or Facebook under my own regular name, and and send me a friend request or a follow request on either of those. And then my book is published by the University of Nebraska Press. You can buy it through them, or you can buy it at Amazon.com, of course. And so you can get it in any of those places. Father's Day is coming up, so if you have a grumpy old man in your life, you might like that book.
It is the perfect Father's Day gift, I tell you. I'm not a father, but I tell you what, if my old man were still around, this would be a book I'd get him. If my dad was a football fan, but yeah, this would be the one book that I would have gotten him if he were still around.
My father would have liked it too, but he passed away before it was published also.
Yeah, and when's your next book coming out?
Yeah, I think sometime around March or April of this coming year.
Okay.
So it's completely written. It's with the publisher, but it takes a while. It doesn't even have a title yet, but it's done.
Okay, great. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, and I know Scott is.
Yeah,
thank you for having me on your show, guys.
Yeah, this has been so much fun.
Thank you. And,
I
Jack,
enjoyed it too.
Jack, it's an honor because I've told Scott I told Scott about your book, and to be able to talk to you and not only talk to you just on the podcast, but we've talked offline. Heck, we're Facebook friends. So, and it's an honor, and I'm looking forward to more conversations as time goes on.
Me too, and I really loved being on your show. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys soon.
All right, take care.
Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
When the summer days grow hotter and hotter and the sun glimmers on the glassy water and no breeze blows the way it ought to, it's time for national beer. You feel dried out as any fossil and you're thirsty with the thirst colossal. There's one sure treat you just can't beat, and that's good old national beer.
Try the pleasant living way to beat the heat of the hottest day. Say national beer, you'll like the taste of national beer. And while we're singing, we're proud to say you can beat the heat of the hottest day with national beer, national beer.
Quality, that's the word for national beer, and I mean real quality. The finest grains, the purest water, the utmost patience in brewing and aging. That's the kind of quality that makes national beer light and refreshing. You can tell by the taste.
Brewed on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay.
This is Johnny Unitas of the Baltimore Colts. Let's go, you Colts.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.